Before we can run our batch processor, there's a few other things we need to save, and those are found down here in the lower left-hand corner of the batch processor window. Let's start with the Output tab. Here you can choose where all of your processed files are going to be placed, because typically you won't want to overwrite the original files, and instead you'll want to make new versions in their new formats and with the new processing on them. So in this Output folder, you could choose a temporary setting, or as the original source path, or choose an explicit path where you choose the folder where you want to save all of these processed files. But one of my favorite methods to use is the subfolder output in source path. And you can see that output has quotes around it. And what that's going to do is make a brand new folder named output in the source path of the original audio files. So I'll choose that. And then if I needed to do any renaming of the files, I could make those settings here, but I'm just going to leave the names the same. Then I'm going to go to the format, and I'm going to choose the file format that I want to save them in. I could save them in a WAV format, or I could choose a multitude of other file types, like AIFF or AAC. But in this particular case, I'm going to retain the WAV file format. However, since I am dithering these files down to a 16-bit word length, I'll want to make sure that I use the WAV 16-bit preset. That will save the dithered files in actual 16-bit format. And then in the Options tab, there's one setting I like to do, and that is to either create the peak files, which are the .gpk files that you see in the WAV folders on your computer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to not create those peak files, so I'll disable that checkbox. And if I wanted to, I could change the XML data, but I'm just going to leave that set to the factory default settings right now. So now I'm ready to execute my batch processor. And there's a few things we're going to be looking at when this happens. We're going to look in this batch processor file window. You can see that all these files right now have little open green circles, which means that they are waiting to be processed. We're also going to look up here and make sure that we're on the Tasks tab so that we can see and monitor the progress of all of our batch processing. So let's go ahead and start this batch processor. I'm going to go to the Edit tab and click on Start. And when the batch processor begins, you'll see that the files that are already being processed now have little gears next to them in this window. But up here in the Tasks window, we can see all of the processing being applied and the progress in this window, and we can monitor their progress. And once the files are done down here in the File window, they're going to go from that open green circle to a solid green circle. So now it's showing us that these files are complete. And now that the batch is finished, I'm going to go over to my Finder and let's look at the results. Here's the original folder that we were working in, but it has created an output folder for us, and in this folder there are all of the batch processed files. Now you'll notice that there are little marker files for every single audio file that was processed. That's because one of the options that I could have chosen in the batch processor is to retain the markers from the original audio files, which I typically like to do because if there are any markers in the originals, they'll be retained in the files that went through the batch processor. So these files are all in WAV format. So now I'm going to show you another trick if you're doing multiple file conversions. So let's go back into Wavelab here, and I'm going to select one of the files in the file window, but then type Control-Command-A to select all of them. Then I'm going to right or Control click and reset the status. So now these files can be processed again. You can see that each file has that open green circle. And now I'm going to convert the same original files into a different file format. So what I'll do is come to the Output folder right here. I'm going to leave this set at the Output in source path setting, but then as far as the format goes, I'm going to change the file format from WAV 16-bit to an encoded format of AAC, and I'm going to choose the iTunes setting. And since I'm going to be using AAC, I won't need to dither, so I'm going to disable this mbit dithering processing, and then I'm going to show you where that option is for the markers. I'm going to disable copy markers right now. And that's all I need to do. If I wanted to start this process again, I would just go under the Edit tab and click Start, and it's going to go through and process all of those files just like I did in the original conversion, but now the MBit processing is turned off, and instead of saving them in a WAV 16-bit file, it's going to save them in an iTunes-compatible AAC format. And when they're complete, I'm going to go back out here to my Finder, and now you can see that for every file, there is an M4A file, which is the AAC file, along with the marker file for the WAV version. So all of these files right here are essentially the same file, with one marker file for the WAV format in 16-bit, and then one iTunes-compatible AAC file. So if this particular process is one that you're going to use a lot, then you'll probably want to save the batch processor. So let's go to the File menu here and choose Save As, choose the batch processor, and then give this a name. So let's call this 48K plus G4 for adding 4 dB of gain, plus dither. Then you want to navigate to where you want to store your batch processor, but when you're done, click Save. Then if you wanted to use those same settings to process even more audio files, you can reopen that batch processor and it will remember all of these settings, and all you'll need to do is add the audio files that you want to process. So that's the batch processor, and next let's talk about the master section.